Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Juliet and for inviting me, and to all of the staff at Cafe OTO. It's really lovely to be here. And I apologize for being such a jarring transition from the previous set into me just talking at you for a while. This is my visual accompaniment. I'll talk a bit more about it later. But for now, you're going to get me, you're going to get this. Feel free to exist in the space however you like. If you want to get up and walk around, if you want to sit down, lie on the floor, whatever feels comfortable, I will not be offended. If you want to close your eyes or if you want to leave the room, just treat this as kind of like a verbal accompaniment to your existence for the next 20 minutes or so. And yeah, I'll get going. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Just before I start, I think one thing I'd like to say is I'd like us to collectively reflect over these next few days for this festival as to what our role might be as people who think a lot about sound, how we make and understand sound, who are very adept at making a lot of sound, and what our responsibility can be when we're facing a lot of state repression and facing the ongoing genocide of Palestinians, especially a government who seeks to demonize protest, make protest against it illegal, in particular, make threats of noise arrest-worthy. I encourage you all to make lots of noise if you can. Cool. So my presentation today is going to follow one of the strands of my PhD project, which I'm currently trying to tease out. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. And after introducing you to my corpus, namely the strange and unwieldy term of outsider music, I want to share some of the historical pathways it's led me to, through understandings of feeling and affect and the ways certain aesthetics get attached to certain bodies, in particular the threat posed by outsider music to normative understandings of value, and even our understandings of experimental music. So to introduce this world to you, let me start with a few stories. In the late 1950s, Jackie Shane escapes the Jim Crow South by joining a traveling circus which takes her to Canada. After being noticed in a bar, she begins a marginal but expansive singing career, tracing her own gender transition in and through vocal performance. She never makes it big. In 1970, 2 decades later, a soul group of 5 teenagers is formed in Cleveland, Ohio, 2 sets of twins and their friend. They record one soaring album full of joy and love and break up a few years later. Their subsequent lives trace an all too normative necropolitical reality for African Americans. 2 died, 2 were incarcerated. One of their songs is later sampled by Kanye West and makes millions. Slightly later in the 70s, a teenager from the Wagner Projects in East Harlem scribbles lyrics on a bathroom wall or under the table during maths class while staying at a Quaker boarding school in Newtown, Pennsylvania. At the encouragement of her music teacher and with money raised by a few generous parents, Shira Small recorded what would be her only album, The Line of Time and the Plane of Now, in 1974 when she was 15 years old. An expansive world of dreaming is lyrically couched amongst radiant and unpredictable piano chords delivered by the sincere, raspy, and still adjusting voice of a teenager. She sings, "Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now, we live forever." So hidden within all these sounds and lives are brief glimpses of what it might mean to create otherwise. They're sounds which do not necessarily fall easy on our ears. Instruments are played enthusiastically, if not accurately. Voices are not traditionally trained. They exceed our expectations, emerging from the uncontainable and shifting bodies of children and adolescents, from queer and gender non-conforming people who evade easily binarized categories, from racialized, disabled, neurodivergent musicians who continually challenge creative notions dictated by whiteness, capability, and bodily expectation. Songs might be original and at times bizarre, collections of sound. They may be radically interpreted well-known songs heard on the radio. What might be said to unite them is that they don't behave. They fail to meet expectations or provide what is traditionally understood as a good, bounded, individualized artistic object. In doing so, they present to us a radically expansive and egalitarian approach to creativity, one which capitalizes on the potentials of experimentation, failure, and a fundamental belief in the potential of amateurism. These recordings form part of my corpus of study. a collection or a coalition of musicians gathered under the umbrella term of outsider music. Following on from outsider art, outsider music is broadly understood as self-taught or naive musicians working outside of normative institutional frameworks, or conversely, non-normative bodies attempting and failing to work within these frameworks. I'm going to do this a lot, by the way, so get used to it. Outsider music's recorded archive consists of a collection of ephemeral sonic objects, often deemed insignificant without use or value, which nonetheless contain incredible resources for alternative conceptions of creative practice. So this is where my project begins, with a search for a genuinely radical creativity, unrestricted by normative, meaning capitalist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal notions of quality, rigor, productivity, and individualism. But subsequently, I want to ask which processes and methods might we use to find these practices? How can we engage with historical objects in generative ways? Why do certain sounds, voices, and creative practices get attached to certain bad affects? And what might this teach us about value? And conversely, how might we look for value in creativity beyond capitalist value? So my first approach in answering this question was to trace the history of the term itself. Outsider music can be understood as the comparatively recent sonic descendant of outsider art, first introduced by Roger Cardinal in his 1972 book of the same name. The term has been critically reassessed in recent years. The label of outsider art, demonstrably seeking to denote a radical form of creativity that lies outside education and culture, is itself a rearticulation of the formerly named art brut, coined by painter and collector Jean Dubuffet in the late 1940s. Now for Dubuffet, this was an art that was direct, innocent, even crude. Brut means raw or unsweetened, and quite contrary to the over-sophistication of conventional culture. Now, despite positioning itself as a radical alternative to the cult of the great artist, Dubuffet's art brut remains distinctly of its historical moment. His project of retrieving art from the ruins of civilization after the Second World War offers a distillation of the values of modernity, both in its insistence in the possibility of a unique, original creative individualism and also in the locations it finds its subjects. Now, for Jean Dubuffet, these creative practices were found in three specific locations: child art, primitive art, and the art of the insane. Children who had not yet been educated, tribal artists who knew nothing of European art traditions, and madmen who are presumed to have been catapulted out of conformity by their psychosis. And this is where this painting can have a bit more of an explanation. Gaston Lutte was... Well, he made this painting while he was incarcerated in a French psychiatric institution in the 1950s. And this was part of Jean Dubuffet's larger collection of work, which he liked to gather and kind of commodify. The selection of these three locations that I spoke about, as well as Dubuffet's attitude towards them, are similarly characteristic of their historical moment. The ubiquity of carceral institutions of schooling and psychiatry, ongoing European colonial extraction, these are projects of modernity which rendered these three political categories, children, disabled people, and racialized/colonized people, to embody certain characteristics, defined as lacking agency, requiring a paternalistic approach. These othered characteristics are then able to be collected, labeled, and characterized. Such approaches are consistent in uncritical discussions of art brut and outsider art, which retain a notion of creative practice that is inherently bound to some form of essentialized or pathologized otherness, in particular disability. As is unsurprising, this othering continues in outsider music's comparatively small body of literature. Music journalist Erwin Chusid is credited with popularizing the term, notably in his 2000 book, Songs in the Key of Z, The Curious Universe of Outsider Music. While commonly used in music journalism, in online forums, and by certain record labels, academic engagement is pretty limited. In fact, there's only one book, David Larouet's 2018 book called American Idiots, Outsider Music, Outsider Art, and the Philosophy of Incompetence. Chusid in Larouet's writing is obsessed with value. Chusid notably asks the reader to imagine a musical universe where standards do not exist, beginning his text with, "Genius, forget it. Talent, beside the point. Welcome to the curious universe of outsider music, a mutant strain of twisted sonic art that's so wrong it's right." For Chusid, the outsider musician is one who is unaware of their own talent, but produces artworks of idiosyncratic originality. They don't boldly break the rules because they don't know there are rules. In this sense, his interpretation plays heavily into a form of mythology surrounding outsider art and music, one which sensationalizes as it provincializes. Larouet, the philosopher, takes a less embracing approach towards outsider music and outsider art. For him, outsider creativity is characterized by a particular stain or flaw in their work which is itself conceptually problematic and poorly executed. So what I'm interested here is what these terms do, and particularly what the word outsider does discursively. I'm interested in which emotions and affects become attached to this word outsider, and how it comes to carry a particular political and aesthetic impetus. Here I'm working with the framework Sarah Ahmed offers us in The Cultural Politics of Emotion, where she tells us that emotions are relational and they work to shape the surfaces of individual and collective bodies. She describes how emotions can move through the movement of circulation of objects, and such objects become sticky or saturated with affect as sites of personal and social tension. And I see outsider as one of these sticky, saturated objects. At times when I was reading these two texts, I found myself focusing less on the specific musicians and sounds being discussed and more on the ways that they were being described. Incompetence, amateurishness, mediocrity, failure, cacophony, idiocy, monstrous, chaotic, difficult, ugly, messy, weird, disgusting, grotesque. These words continuously jump up from both pages, from the pages of both texts. They present outsider music with a sort of morbid fascination, functioning as collectors and exhibitors as much as analysts. Moving away from such models, I want to ask, what if we were able to detach these particular aesthetics from conventional notions of musical value? Or rather, if we began to listen to them differently, precisely for their negative relation to conventional value, embracing new forms of listening and questioning the framework of musical value itself. In essence, how do I treat these sticky affects and the aesthetics and the bodies they attach themselves to as political agents or insurgents? The history of tying certain sounds and affects to certain bodies is a long one, one that's explored extensively by Jennifer Stover in her work, The Sonic Color Line, which identifies how certain sonic qualities and aesthetics became inexorably linked to and co-constituted with the racial settler colonial logics of the US during the 19th century in particular. In this context, these sonic qualities were materialized and corporealized in relation to notions of whiteness and blackness. So while whiteness is notorious for representing itself as invisible, or in this case, inaudible, at least to white people, sounds linked to racialized bodies, such as music and the ambient sounds of everyday living, became characterized as noise, sounds loud and unruly other. Subsequently, specific sonic aesthetic qualities became and continue to be understood as dichotomously and racially essentialized within whiteness and blackness, music and noise, sense and nonsense, cultivated, raw, controlled and excessive, proper and improper, quiet and loud, smooth and rough, cold and emotional. That's her words that she uses to describe them. Such sonic interpretations continue to shape our listening practices in the present, by shaping our understanding and valuing of certain musical objects by their proximity to whiteness, or manifesting materially in the way certain voices, musics, and sounds of sociality are deemed deviant and policed. For understanding how outsider music is understood and valued, we can think about how these oral qualities are read as sonic miscommunications by a dominant culture of listening. As well as seeing the ways in which these aesthetic qualities affect the ways racialized outsider musicians are heard, I want to think about the ways in which such qualities extend to perceptions of various forms of sonic otherness, in particular the performances and voices of disabled, gender non-conforming and children musicians, which populate outsider music. My position is that outsider music's incredible ability to resist these roots into being valued or validated by the listening cultures of modernity make it precisely the site where we should be looking for alternative conceptions of creative practice. Indeed, I wonder if focusing on it might function as a useful apposition to some of the pitfalls that we encounter when engaging with experimental music more broadly. So the many negative affects which get associated with outsider music, such as being ugly, strange, weird, difficult, these are all qualities also often associated with music gathered under the label of experimental, contemporary, or new music. Indeed, the possession of such qualities by musics coming from this alternative tradition, one emerging from institutionalized forms of music creation within the academy, in concert halls, often relying on scores or highly trained performers, are often indicators of a particular innovative value. While describing potentially similar sonic objects, the attachments of either outsider or experimental to music produce radically different responses. And subsequently, the kinds of value that get attached to each are radically different. So the words experimental and experimentalism are themselves tied to particular cultural and political moments, as Natalia Cesare points out in her work, Experimental, American Literature and the Aesthetics of Knowledge. So for Cesare, rather than a consistent aesthetic or quantifiable entity, experimental as a label functions rather as like a signifier, which endows certain objects with epistemic virtue. So it deems certain things as good forms of knowledge making, instilling them with virtues of newness or inventiveness. But rather than being innocent, these virtues and subsequently normative understandings of experimentalism continue to be reliant on the white supremacist scientific and modernist logics that we discussed before for their reification. In fact, when she's speaking about the North American tradition of experimental writing, Natalia Cesare defines experimentalism as a white recovery project, noting that any account of experimental writing that hopes to make sense of its uses and affordances must attempt to explain its ongoing and recently much debated centering of racial whiteness. So we might think then of experimental music as outsider music's well-behaving counterpart, one which perpetuates the desires for newness, progress, and exploration of new creative terrain integral to modernity. It is true that, like outsider music, experimental music tends to not be commercially successful. There are examples of specific pieces and composers within that tradition working against traditional notions of musical value implied by certain aesthetic and structural qualities or desires for singular authorship. That being said, at least in comparison to outsider music, this music still has access to the kind of epistemic virtue that outsider music does not. Indeed, this musical tradition and its practices, even when incorporating difficult or ugly aesthetic qualities, frequently remains complicit in the white supremacist projects of knowledge creation, Orientalist fetishization, and the desire for rigorous intellectual production, as has been pointed out by Elie Hissama, Dylan Robertson, and others. So, any anti-hegemonic approach towards defining creative practice or looking for new and radical possibilities was therefore look towards and identify forms of creative production which work against these virtues. We might then begin to consider outsider music as an alternative archive of creative practice, which disengages from this tradition, one whose radical essence comes from its inability and refusal to operate within the aesthetic and personal desires of whiteness of late capitalist modernity. If we similarly understand whiteness as property, how does outsider music encapsulate an aesthetic approach to creativity which resists epistemic and economic ownership? If outsider music continually evades or exceeds value under these parameters, then by taking the forms of creativity present in outsider music seriously, we might be led to creative and lived possibilities which enable new and resistive kinds of imaginative sociality. Where outsider music might provide a particularly unique form of sonic miscommunication is an overabundance of the body in its recorded archive, vocal imperfections and harsh childlike sonic qualities, badly played instruments where we hear the missed cymbal hit, dissonant notes bunched together, strange or overly emotional interpretations of familiar tunes, weird lyrical and other creative choices, the hiss and noise of cheap microphones and damaged reused tape, extraneous domestic or performative sounds. These are all instances where we are reminded of the performer, their body, and the situation where they evade oral invisibility. They might be considered simultaneously out of tune with our expectations and too in tune with their bodies. This excess is where the ugly feelings are produced, but this excess might also be where we find alternative possibilities for creative practice. So by sitting with these unconventional and ugly feelings, we are diagnostically led towards alternative and unorthodox ways of creating and being. It forces us to confront what ugliness or disgust actually sounds like and why. which aesthetic qualities and the bodies which produce them fail to meet societal expectations, don't behave as they should. It is my assertion that paying close attention to outsider music leads us to resistive and creative practices lying right under our fingertips, forcing a profound reconsideration of what the popular means in popular music and what musical value even means. Thank you very much.